Chapter 13. The letter that started me. I was going to say startled me, but only imaginative people are startled. The letter, then, that started me from Bronx Park to the south, I print without the permission of my superior, Professor Farrago. I have not obtained his permission for the somewhat exciting reason that nobody knows where he is. Publicity being now recognized as the annihilator of mysteries, a benevolent purpose alone inspires me to publish a letter so strange, so pathetically remarkable, in view of what has recently occurred. As I say, I had only just returned from Java with a valuable collection of undescribed isopods, an order of Edriophthalma crustaceans with 7 free thoracic somites furnished with 14 legs. And I beg my reader's pardon, but my reader will see the necessity for the author's absolute accuracy in insisting on detail, because the story that follows is a dangerous story for a scientist to tell, in view of the vast amount of nonsense and fiction in circulation masquerading as stories of scientific adventure. I was, therefore, anticipating a delightful summer's work with pen and microscope, when, on April 1st, I received the following extraordinary letter from Professor Farrago. In Camp, Little Sprite Lake, Everglades, Florida, March 15, 1902. My dear Mr. Gilland, on receipt of this communication, you will immediately secure for me the following articles: 1 complete outfit of women's clothing, 1 camera, 1 light steel cage large enough for you to stand in, 1 stenographer, male sex, 1 5-pound steel tank with siphon and hose attachment, 1 rifle and ammunition, 3 ounces rhodium oxide, 1 ounce chlorate strontium. You will then, within 24 hours, set out with the stenographer and the supplies mentioned, and join me in camp on Little Sprite Lake. This order is formal and admits of no delay. You will appreciate the necessity of absolute and unquestioning obedience when I tell you that I am practically on the brink of the most astonishing discovery recorded in natural history since Monsieur Zani discovered the purple-spotted Zumbach in Nyaza, and that I depend upon you and your zeal and fidelity for success. I dare not, lest my letter fall into unscrupulous hands, convey to you more than a hint of what lies before us in these uncharted solitudes of the Everglades. You must read between the lines when I say that because one can see through a sheet of glass, the glass is none the less solid and palpable. One can see through it, if that is also seeing it, but one can nevertheless hold it and feel it and receive from it sensations of cold or heat according to its temperature. Certain jellyfish are absolutely transparent when in the water, and one can only know of their presence by accidental contact, not by sight. Have you ever thought that possibly there might exist larger and more highly organized creatures, transparent to eyesight, yet palpable to touch? Little Sprite Lake is the jumping-off place. Beyond lie the Everglades, the outskirts of which are haunted by the Seminoles, the interior of which have never been visited by man, as far as we know. As you are aware, no general survey of Florida has yet been made. There exist no maps of the Everglades south of Okeechobee, and even Little Sprite Lake is but a vague blot on our maps. We know, of course, that south of the 11,000 square miles of fresh water which is called Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades form a vast delta-like projection of thousands and thousands of square miles. Darkest Africa is no longer a mystery, but the Everglades today remain the somber secret of our continent. And today, this unknown expanse of swamps, barrens, forests, and lagoons is greater than in the days of De Soto, because the entire region has been slowly rising. All this, my dear sir, you already know, and I ask your indulgence for recalling the facts to your memory. I do it for this reason. The search for what I am seeking may lead us to utter destruction, and therefore my formal orders to you should be modified to this extent. Do you volunteer? If you volunteer, my orders remain. If not, turn this letter over to Mr. Kingsley, who will find for me the companion I require. In the event of your coming, you must break your journey at False Cape and ask for an old man named Slunk. He will give you a packet, you will give him $1, and drive on to Cape Canaveral, and you will do what is to be done there. From there to Fort Kissimmee to Okeechobee, traversing the lake to the Reeder River, where I have marked the trail to Little Sprite. At Little Sprite I shall await you. Beyond that point, a merciful Providence alone can know what awaits us. Yours fraternally, Farrago. P.S. I think that you had better make your will and suggest the same idea to the stenographer who is to accompany you. F. And that was the letter I received, while seated comfortably on the floor of my workroom, surrounded by innocent isopods, all patiently awaiting scientific investigation. And this is what I did. Within 24 hours, I had assembled the supplies required: the cage, the woman's clothing, tank, arms and ammunition, and the chemicals. I had secured accommodations for that evening on the Florida, Volusia, and Fort Lauderdale Railway, as far as Citron City, and I had been interviewing stenographers all day long, the results of an innocently worded advertisement in the daily newspapers. It was now very close to the time when I must summon a cab and drive to the ferry, and yet I was still shy one stenographer. I had seen scores. They simply would not listen to the proposition. Why does a gentleman in the backwoods of Florida want a stenographer? They demanded. And as I had not the faintest idea, I could only say so. I think the majority interviewed concluded I had escaped from a state institution. As the time for departure approached, I became desperate, urging and beseeching applicants to accompany me. But neither sympathy for my instant need nor desire for salary moved them. I waited until the last moment, hoping against hope. Then, with a groan of despair, I seized luggage and raincoat, made for the door, and flung it open, only to find myself face to face with an attractive young girl, apparently on the point of pressing the electric button. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I have a train to catch." She was noticeably attractive in her storm coat and pretty hat, and I really was sorry. So sorry that I added, "I have about 20 seconds to place at your service before I go." "20 will be sufficient," she replied pleasantly. "I saw your advertisement for a stenographer." "We require a man," I interposed hastily. "Have you engaged him?" "No." We looked at each other. "You wouldn't accept anyway," I began. "How do you know?" "You wouldn't leave town, would you?" "Yes, if you required it." "What, go to Florida?" "Yes, if I must." "But think of the alligators. Think of the snakes. Big, bitey snakes." "Gracious!" she exclaimed, eyes growing bigger. "Indians, too. Unreconciled sulky Seminoles. Fevers, mud puddles, spiders. And only $50 a week." I'll go," she stammered. "Go," I repeated grimly. "Then you have exactly 2 3/4 seconds left for preparations." Instinctively, she raised her little gloved hand and patted her hair. "I'm ready," she said unsteadily. "1 extra second to make your will," I added, stunned by her self-possession. I have nothing to leave. Nobody to leave it to," she said, smiling. "I am ready." I took that extra second to myself for a lightening course in reflection upon the effects and consequences. "It's silly. It's probably murder," I said. "But you're engaged. Now we must run for it." And that is how I came to engage the services of Miss Helen Barrison as stenographer. Chapter 14. At noon on the second day, I disembarked from the train at Citron City with all the paraphernalia: cage, chemicals, arsenal, and stenographer, an accumulation of very dusty impedimenta, all but the stenographer. By 3 o'clock, our hotel livery rig was speeding along the beach at False Cape towards the tall lighthouse looming above the dunes. The abode of a gentleman named Slunk was my goal. I sat brooding in the rickety carriage, still dazed by the rapidity of my flight from New York. The stenographer sat beside me, blue eyes bright with excitement, fair hair blowing in the sea wind. Our railway companionship had been of the slightest, also absolutely formal, for I was too absorbed in conjecturing the meaning of this journey to be more than absent-mindedly civil, and she, I fancy, had had time for repentance, and perhaps for a little fright, though I could discover traces of neither. I remember she left the train at some city or other where we were held for an hour, and out of the car window I saw her returning with a brand-new gripsack. She must have bought clothes, for she continued to remain cool and fresh in her summer shirtwaists and short outing skirt, and she looked immaculate now, sitting there beside me, the trace of a smile curving her red mouth. "I'm looking for a personage named Slunk," I observed. After a moment's silent consideration of the Atlantic Ocean, she said, "When do my duties begin, Mr. Gilland?" "The Lord alone knows," I replied grimly. "Are you repenting of your bargain?" "I am quite happy," she said serenely. Remorse smote me that I had consented to engage this frail, pink-and-ivory biped for an enterprise which lay outside the suburbs of Manhattan. I glanced guiltily at my victim. She sat there, the incarnation of New York piquancy, a translated denizen of the metropolis, a slender spirit of the back offices of skyscrapers. Why had I lured her hither, here where the heavy, lavender-tinted breakers thundered on a lost coast, here where above the dune jungles vultures soared, and snowy-headed eagles, hulking along the sands, tore dead fish and yelped at us as we passed? Strange waters, strange skies, a strange lost land, a-quiver under an exotic sun. And there she sat, with her wise eyes of a child, unconcerned, watching the world in perfect confidence. "May I pay a little compliment to your pluck?" I asked, amused. "Certainly," she said, smiling as the maid of Manhattan alone knows how to smile, shyly, inquiringly, with a lingering hint of laughter in the curled lips' corners. Then her sensitive features fell a trifle. "Not pluck," she observed, "but necessity. I had no chance to choose, no time to wait. My last dollar, Mr. Gilland, is in my purse." With a gay little gesture, she drew it from her shirt front, then, smiling, sat turning it over and over in her lap. The sun fell in her hands, gilding the smooth skin with the first tint of sunburn. Under the corner of her eyes, above the rounded cheeks, a pink stain lay like the first ripening flush on a wild strawberry. That, too, was the mark left by the caress of wind and sun. I had no idea she was so pretty. "I think we'll enjoy this adventure," I said. "Don't you?" "I try to make the best of things," she said, gazing off into the horizon haze. "Look," she added, "is that a man?" A spot far away on the beach caught my eye. At first I thought it was a pelican, and small wonder, too, for the dumpy, waddling, goose-necked individual who loomed up resembled a heavy-bottomed bird more than a human being. "Do you suppose that could be Mr. Slunk?" asked the stenographer, as our vehicle drew nearer. He looked as though his name ought to be Slunk. He was digging coquina clams, and he dug with a pecking motion, like a water turkey mastering a mullet too big for it. His name was Slunk. He admitted it when I accused him. Our Negro driver drew rein, and I descended to the sand and gazed on Mr. Slunk. He was, as I have said, not impressive, even with the tremendous background of sky and ocean. "I've come over 1,000 miles to see you," I said, reluctant to admit that I had come as far to see such a specimen of human architecture. A weather-beaten grin stretched the skin that covered his face, and he shoved a hairy paw into the pockets of his overalls, digging deeply into profound depths. First he brought to light a twist of South Carolina tobacco, which he leisurely inserted into his mouth, not apparently for pleasure, but merely to get rid of it. The second object excavated from the overalls was a small packet addressed to me. This he handed to me. I gravely handed him a silver dollar. He went back to his clam digging, and I entered the carriage and drove on. All had been carried out according to the letter of my instructions so far, and my spirits brightened. "If you don't mind, I'll read my instructions," I said in high good humor. "Pray do not hesitate," she said, smiling in sympathy. So I opened the little packet and read. "Drive to Cape Canaveral along the beach. You will find a gang of men at work on a government breakwater. The superintendent is Mr. Rowan. Show him this letter. Farrago." Rather disappointed, for I had been expecting to find in the packet some key to the interesting mystery which had sent Professor Farrago into the Everglades, I thrust the missive into my pocket and resumed a study of the immediate landscape. It had not changed as we progressed. Ocean, sand, low dunes, crowned with impenetrable tangles of wild bay, sparkleberry, and live oak, with here and there a weather-twisted palmetto sprawling, and here and there the battered blades of cactus and Spanish bayonet thrust menacingly forward, and over all the vultures sailing, some mere circling motes lost in the blue above, some shearing the earth so close that their swiftly sweeping shadows slanted continually across our road. "I detest a buzzard," I said aloud. "I thought they were crows," she confessed. "Carrion crows, yes. The carrion crows sing, caw, caw. Only they don't," I added, my song putting me in good humor once more, and I glanced askance at the pretty stenographer. "It is a pleasure to be employed by agreeable people," she said innocently. "Oh, I can be much more agreeable than that," I said. "Is Professor Farrago amusing?" she asked. "Well, oh, certainly, but not in the way I am." Suddenly it flashed upon me that my superior was a confirmed hater of unmarried women. I had clean forgotten it, and now the full import of what I had done scared me silent. "Is anything the matter?" asked Miss Barrison. "No, not yet," I said ominously. How on earth could I have overlooked that well-known fact? The hurry and anxiety, the stress of instant preparation and departure had clean driven it from my absent-minded head. Jogging on over the sand, I sat silent, cudgeling my brains for a solution of the disastrous predicament I had gotten into. I pictured the astonished rage of my superior, my probable dismissal from employment, perhaps the general overturning and smash-up of the entire expedition. A distant dark object on the beach concentrated my distracted thoughts. It must be the breakwater at Cape Canaveral, and it was the breakwater, swarming with Negro workmen, who were swinging great blocks of coquina into cemented beds, singing and whistling at their labor. I forgot my predicament when I saw a thin white man in sun helmet and khaki directing the work from the beach, and as our horses plodded up, I stepped out and hailed him by name. "Yes, my name is Rowan," he said instantly, turning to meet me. His sharp, clear eyes included the vehicle and the stenographer, and he lifted his helmet, then looked squarely at me. "My name is Gilland," I said, dropping my voice and stepping nearer. "I have just come from Bronx Park, New York." He bowed, waiting for something more from me, so I presented my credentials. His formal manner changed at once. "Come over here and let us talk a bit," he said cordially, then hesitated, glancing at Miss Barrison. "If your wife could excuse us." The pretty stenographer colored, and I dryly set Mr. Rowan right, which appeared to disturb him more than his mistake. "Pardon me, Mr. Gilland, but you do not propose to take this young girl into the Everglades, do you?" "That's what I propose to do," I said brusquely. Perfectly aware that I resented his inquiry, he cast a perplexed and troubled glance at her, then slowly led the way to a great block of sun-warmed coquina, where he sat down, motioning me to do the same. "I see," he said, "that you do not know just where you are going or just what you are expected to do." "No, I don't," I said. "Well, I'll tell you then. You are going into the devil's own country to look for something that I fled 500 miles to avoid." "Is that so?" I said uneasily. "That is so, Mr. Gilland." "Oh, and what is this object that I'm to look for, and from which you have fled 500 miles?" "I don't know." "You don't know what you ran away from?" "No, sir. Perhaps if I had known, I should have run 1,000 miles." We eyed one another. "You think, then, that I'd better send Miss Barrison back to New York?" I asked. "I certainly do. It may be murder to take her." "Then I'll do it," I said nervously. "Back she goes, from the first railroad station." In a flash, the thought came to me that here was a way to avoid the wrath of Professor Farrago, and a good excuse, too. He might forgive my not bringing a man as stenographer, in view of my limited time. He never would forgive my presenting him with a woman. "She must go back," I repeated, and it rather surprised me to find myself already anticipating loneliness, something that never in all my travels had I experienced before. "By the first train," I added, firmly disliking Mr. Rowan without any reason except that he suddenly deprived me of my stenographer. "What I have to tell you," he began, lighting a cigarette, the mate to which I declined, "is this. 3 years ago, before I entered this contracting business, I was in the government employ as officer in the Coast Survey. Our duties took us into Florida waters. We were months at a time working on shore." He pulled thoughtfully at his cigarette and blew a light cloud into the air. "I had leave for a month once, and like an ass I prepared to spend it in a hunting trip among the Everglades." He crossed his lean legs and gazed meditatively at his cigarette. "I believe," he went on, "that we penetrated the Everglades farther than any white man who ever lived to return. There's nothing very dismal about the Everglades, the greater part, I mean. You get high and low hummock, marshes, creeks, lakes, and all that. If you get lost, you're a goner. If you acquire fever, you're as well off as the seraphim, and not a whit better. There are the usual animals there, bears, little black fellows, lynxes, deer, panthers, alligators, and a few stray crocodiles. As for snakes, of course, they're there, moccasins aplenty, some rattlers, but after all, not as many snakes as one finds in Alabama or even northern Florida and Georgia. The Seminoles won't help you, won't even talk to you. They're a sullen pack, but not murderous as far as I know. Beyond their inner limits lie the unknown regions." He bit the wet end from his cigarette. "I went there," he said. "I came out as soon as I could." "Why?" "Well, for one thing, my companion died of fright." "Fright? What at?" "Well, there's something in there." "What?" He fixed a penetrating gaze on me. "I don't know, Mr. Gilland." "Did you see anything to frighten you?" I insisted. "No, but I felt something." He dropped his cigarette and ground it into the sand viciously. "To cut it short," he said, "I am most unwillingly led to believe that there are creatures of some sort in the Everglades, living creatures quite as large as you or I, and that they are perfectly transparent as a colorless jellyfish." Instantly, the veiled import of Professor Farrago's letter was made clear to me. He, too, believed that. "It embarrasses me like the devil to say such a thing," continued Rowan, digging in the sand with his spurred heels. "It seems so like a whopping lie. It seems so childish and ridiculous, so cursed cheap. But I fled, and there you are. I might add," he said indifferently, "that I have the ordinary portion of courage allotted to normal men." "But what do you believe these animals to be?" I asked, fascinated. "I don't know." An obstinate look came into his eyes. "I don't know, and I absolutely refuse to speculate for the benefit of anybody. I wouldn't do it for my friend Professor Farrago, and I'm not going to do it for you," he ended, laughing a rather grim laugh that somehow jarred me into realizing the amazing import of his story. For I do not doubt it, strange as it was, fantastic, incredible though it sounded in the ears of a scientist. What it was that carried conviction, I do not know. Perhaps the fact that my superior credited it. Perhaps the manner of narration, told in quiet, commonplace phrases by an exceedingly practical and unimaginative young man who was plainly embarrassed in the telling. The story rang out like a shout in a canyon, startling because of the absolute lack of emphasis employed in the telling. Professor Farrago asked me to speak of this to no one except the man who should come to his assistance. He desired the first chance of clearing this rather perplexing matter. No doubt he didn't want exploring parties prowling about him, added Rowan, smiling. But there's no fear of that, I fancy. I never expect to tell that story again, to anybody. I shouldn't have told him, only somehow it's worried me for 3 years. And though I was deadly afraid of ridicule, I finally made up my mind that science ought to have a hack at it. When I was in New York last winter, I summoned up courage and wrote Professor Farrago. He came to see me at the Holland House that same evening. I told him as much as I shall ever tell anybody. That is all, Mr. Gilland. For a long time I sat silent, musing over the strange words. After a while I asked him whether Professor Farrago was supplied with provisions, and he said that he was, that a great store of staples and tins of concentrated rations had been carried in as far as Little Sprite Lake, that Professor Farrago was now there alone, having insisted upon dismissing all those he had employed. There was no practical use for a guide, added Rowan, because no cracker, no Indian, and no guide knows the region beyond the Seminole country. I rose, thanking him and offering my hand. He took it and shook it in a manly fashion, saying, I consider Professor Farrago a very brave man. I may say the same of any man who volunteers to accompany him. Goodbye, Mr. Gilland. I most earnestly wish for your success. Professor Farrago left this letter for you. And that was all. I climbed back into the rickety carriage, carrying my unopened letter. The Negro driver cracked his whip and whistled, and the horses trotted inland over a fine shell road which was to lead us across Verbena Junction to Citron City. Half an hour later, we crossed the tracks at Verbena and turned into a broad marl road. This aroused me from my deep and speculative reverie, and after a few moments I asked Miss Barrison's indulgence and read the letter from Professor Farrago which Mr. Rowan had given me. Dear Mr. Gilland, you know now all I dared not write, fearing to bring a swarm of explorers about my ears in case the letter was lost and found by unscrupulous meddlers. If you still are willing to volunteer, knowing all that I know, join me as soon as possible. If family considerations deter you from taking what perhaps is an insane risk, I shall not expect you to join me. In that event, return to New York immediately and send Kingsley. Yours, F. What the deuce is the matter with him? I exclaimed irritably. I'll take any chances Kingsley does. Miss Barrison looked up in surprise. Miss Barrison, I said, plunging into the subject head first, I'm extremely sorry, but I have news that forces me to believe the journey is too dangerous for you to attempt, so I think that it would be much better. The consternation in her pretty face checked me. I'm awfully sorry, I muttered, appalled by her silence. But you engaged me. I know it. I should not have done it. But you did engage me, didn't you? I believe that I did. Of course. But a verbal contract is binding between honorable people, isn't it, Mr. Gilland? Yes, but... And ours was a verbal contract, and in consideration you paid me my first week's salary, and I bought shirt-waists and a short skirt and 3 changes of... and toothbrushes, and... I know, I groaned. But I'll fix all that. You can't if you break your contract. Why not? Because, she said, flushing up, I should not accept. You don't understand. Really, I do. You're going into a dangerous country, and you're afraid I'll be frightened. It's something like that. Tell me what the dangers are. Alligators, big bitey snakes. Oh, you've said all that before. Seminoles. And that too. What else is there? Did the young man in the sun helmet tell you of something worse? Yes, much worse. Something so dreadfully horrible that... What? I am not at liberty to tell you, Miss Barrison, I said, striving to appear shocked. It would not make any difference anyway, she observed calmly. I'm not afraid of anything in the world. Yes, you are, I said. Listen to me. I'd be awfully glad to have you go. I really had no idea how I'd miss you. Miss such pleasant companionship. But it is not possible. The recollection of Professor Farrago's aversion suddenly returned. No, I said. It can't be done. I'm most unhappy over this mistake of mine. Please don't look at me as though you were ready to cry. Don't discharge me, Mr. Gilland, she said. I'm a brute to do it, but I must. I was a bigger brute to engage you, but I did. Please don't look at me that way, Miss Barrison. As a matter of fact, I'm tender-hearted, and I can't endure it. If only you knew what I'd been through, you wouldn't send me away, she said in a low voice. It took my last penny to clothe myself and pay for the last lesson at the College of Stenography. I lived on almost nothing for 2 weeks. Every respectable place was filled. I walked and walked and walked, and nobody wanted me. They all required people with experience. And how can I have experience until I begin, Mr. Gilland? I was perfectly desperate when I went to see you, knowing that you had advertised for a man. The slightest break in her clear voice scared me. I'm not going to cry, she said, striving to smile. If I must go, I will go. I didn't mean to say all this, but I've been so discouraged, and you were not very cross with me. Smitten with remorse, I picked up her hand and fell to patting it violently, trying to think of something to say. The exercise did not appear to stimulate my wits. Then I'm going with you, she asked. I will see, I said weakly, but I fear there's trouble ahead for this expedition. I fear there is, she agreed in a cheerful voice. You have a rifle and a cage in your luggage. Are you going to trap Indians and have me report their language? No, I'm not going to trap Indians, I said sharply. They may trap us, but that's a detail. What I want to say to you is this. Professor Farrago detests unmarried women, and I forgot it when I engaged you. Oh, is that all? She asked, laughing. Not all, but enough to cost me my position. How absurd. Why, there are millions of things we might do. Millions. What's one of them? I inquired. Why, we might pretend to be married. Her frank and absolute innocent delight in this suggestion was refreshing but troubling. We would have to be demonstrative to make that story go, I said. Why? Well-bred people are not demonstrative in public, she retorted, turning a trifle pink. No, but in private. I think there is no necessity for carrying a pleasantry into our private life, she said, in a perfectly amiable voice. Anyway, if Professor Farrago's feelings are to be spared, no sacrifice on the part of a mere girl could be too great. She added gaily, I will wear men's clothes if you wish. You may have to anyhow in the jungle, I said, and as it's not an uncommon thing these days, nobody would ever take you for anything except what you are, a very willful and plucky and persistent and... And what, Mr. Gilland? And attractive, I muttered. Thank you, Mr. Gilland. You're welcome, I snapped. The near whistle of a locomotive warned us, and I rose in the carriage, looking out across the sand hills. That is probably our train, observed the pretty stenographer. Our train? Yes, isn't it? Then you insist? No, Mr. Gilland. I only trust implicitly in my employer. We'll wait till we get to Citron City, I said weakly. Then it will be time enough to discuss the situation, won't it? Yes, indeed, she said, smiling. But she knew, and I already feared, that the situation was no longer admitted of discussion. In a few moments more we emerged, without warning, from the scrub-crested sand hills into the single white street of Citron City, where china trees hung heavy with bloom, and magnolias, already set with perfumed candelabra, spread soft, checkered shadows over the marl. The train lay at the station, oceans of heavy black smoke lazily flowing from the locomotive. Negroes were hoisting empty fruit crates aboard the baggage car, through the door of which I caught a glimpse of my steel cage and remaining paraphernalia, all securely crated. "Telegram here for Mr. Gilland," remarked the operator, lounging at his window as we descended from our dusty vehicle. He had not addressed himself to anybody in particular, but I said that I was Mr. Gilland, and he produced the envelope. "Toted in from Okeechobee?" he inquired listlessly. "Probably. It's signed Farrago, isn't it?" "It's for you, sir, I reckon," said the operator, handing it out with a yawn. Then he removed his hat and fanned his head, which was perfectly bald. I opened the yellow envelope. "Get me a good dog with points," was the laconic message, and it irritated me to receive such idiotic instructions at such a time and in such a place. A good dog! Where the mischief could I find a dog in a town consisting of 10 houses and a water tank? I said as much to the bald-headed operator, who smiled warily and replaced his hat. "Dog? There's more hound dogs in Citron City than they's wood ticks to keep them busy. I reckon $1 do ya a heap for you, sir." "Could you get me a dog for $1?" I asked. "One with points." "Points? I surely can, sir. Plenty of points. What kind of dog do you require, sir? Live dog, dead dog, hound dog, raid dog, hog dog, coon dog?" The locomotive emitted a long, lazy, softly modulated, and thoroughly southern toot. I handed the operator a silver dollar, and he presently emerged from his office and slouched off up the street, while I walked with Miss Barrison to the station platform, where I resumed the discussion of her future movements. "You are very young to take such a risk," I said gravely. "Had I not better buy your ticket back to New York? The northbound train meets this one. I suppose we are waiting for it now." I stopped, conscious of her impatience. Her face flushed brightly. "Yes, I think it is best. I have embarrassed you too long already." "Don't say that," I muttered. I shall be deadly bored without you." "I am not an entertainer, only a stenographer," she said curtly. "Please get me my ticket, Mr. Gilland." She gazed at me from the car platform. The locomotive tooted 2 drawling toots. "It is for your sake," I said, avoiding her gaze as the far-off whistle of the northbound express came floating out of the blue distance. She did not answer. I fished out my watch, regarding it in silence, listening to the hum of the approaching train, which ought presently to bear her away into the north, where nothing could menace her except the brilliant pitfalls of a Christian civilization. But I stood there, temporizing, unable to utter a word as her train shot us by with a rush, slower and slower, and finally stopped with a long-drawn sigh from the air brakes. At that instant the telegraph operator appeared, carrying a dog by the scruff of the neck, a sad-eyed, ewe-necked dog, from the 4 corners of which dangled enormous, cushion-like paws. He yelped when he beheld me. Miss Barrison leaned down from the car platform and took the animal into her arms, uttering a suppressed exclamation of pity as she lifted him up. "You have your hands full," she said to me. "I'll take him into the car for you." She mounted the steps. I followed with the valises, striving to get a good view of my acquisition over her shoulder. "This isn't the kind of dog I wanted," I repeated again and again, inspecting the animal as it sprawled on the floor of the car at the edge of Miss Barrison's skirt. "That dog is all voice and feet and emotion. What makes it stick up its paws like that? I don't want that dog, and I'm not going to identify myself with it. Where's the operator?" I turned towards the car window. The operator's bald head was visible on a line with the sill, and I made motions at him. He bowed with courtly grace, as though I were thanking him. "I'm not," I cried, shaking my head. "I wanted a dog with points, not the kind of points that stick up all over this dog. Take him away!" The operator's head appeared to be gliding out of my range of vision. Then the windows of the northbound train slid past, faster and faster. A melancholy grace note from the dog, a jolt, and I turned around, appalled. "This train is going," I stammered, "and you are on it." Miss Barrison sprang up and started towards the door, and I sped after her. "I can jump," she said breathlessly, edging out to the platform. "Please let me. There is time yet. If you only wouldn't hold me so tight." A few moments later, we walked slowly back together through the car and took seats facing one another. Between us sat the hound dog, a prey to melancholy unutterable. Chapter 15. It was on Sunday when I awoke to the realization that I had quitted civilization and was afloat on an unfamiliar body of water in an open boat containing one light steel cage, one rifle and ammunition, one stenographer, 3 ounces rhosium oxide, 1 hound dog, 2 valises. A playful wave slopped over the bow, and I lost count, but the pretty stenographer made the inventory, while I resumed the oars, and the dog punctured the primeval silence with staccato yelps. A few minutes later, everything and everybody was accounted for. The sky was blue, and the palms waved, and several species of dicky birds turned up as I pulled with powerful strokes out into the sunny waters of Little Sprite Lake, now within a few miles of my journey's end. From ponds hidden in the marshes, herons rose in lazily laborious flight, flapping low across the water. High in the cypress, yellow-eyed ospreys bent crested heads to watch our progress. Sun-baked alligators, lying heavily in the shoreward sedge, slid open glassy eyes as we passed. "Even the gators make eyes at you," I said, resting on my oars. We were on terms of badinage. "Who was it who shed crocodile tears at the prospect of shipping me north?" she inquired. "Speaking of tears," I observed, "somebody is likely to shed a number when Professor Farrago is picked up." "Pooh," she said, and snapped her pretty sun-tanned fingers, and I resumed the oars in time to avoid shipwreck on a large mud bar. She reclined in the stern, serenely occupied with the view, now and then caressing the discouraged dog, now and then patting her hair where the wind had loosened a bright strand. "If Professor Farrago didn't expect a woman stenographer," she said abruptly, "why did he instruct you to bring a complete outfit of women's clothing?" "I don't know," I said tartly. "But you bought them. Are they for a young woman or an old woman?" "I don't know. I sent a messenger to a department store. I don't know what he bought." "Didn't you look them over?" "No. Why? I should have been no wiser. I fancy they're all right, because the bill was $1,800. The pretty stenographer sat up abruptly. "Is that much?" I asked uneasily. "I've always heard women's clothing was expensive. Wasn't it enough? I told the boy to order the best. Professor Farrago always requires the very best scientific instruments, and I listed the clothes as scientific accessories, that being the object of this expedition." "What are you laughing at?" When it pleased her to recover her gravity, she announced her desire to inspect and repack the clothing, but I refused. "They're for Professor Farrago," I said. "I don't know what he wants of them. I don't suppose he intends to wear 'em and caper about the jungle, but they're his. I got them because he told me to. I bought a cage, too, to fit myself, but I don't suppose he means to put me in it. Perhaps," I added, "he may invite you into it." "Let me refold the gowns," she pleaded persuasively. "What does a clumsy man know about packing such clothing as that? If you don't, they'll be ruined. It's a shame to drag those boxes about through mud and water." So we made a landing and lifted out and unlocked the boxes. All I could see inside were mounds of lace and ribbons, and with the vague idea that Miss Barrison needed no assistance, I returned to the boat and sat down to smoke until she was ready. When she summoned me, her face was flushed and her eyes bright. "Those are certainly the most beautiful things," she said softly. "Why, it is like a bride's trousseau, absolutely complete, all except the bridal gown." "Isn't there a dress there?" I exclaimed in alarm. "No, not a day dress." Night dresses? I shrieked. He doesn't want women's night dresses. He's a bachelor. Good heavens, I've done it this time. But who is to wear them? She asked. How do I know? I don't know anything. I can only presume that he doesn't intend to open a department store in the Everglades. And if any lady is to wear garments in his vicinity, I assume that those garments are to be anything except diaphanous. Please take your seat in the boat, Miss Barrison. I want to row and think. I had had my fill of exercise and thought, when, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Miss Barrison directed my attention to a point of palms jutting out into the water about a mile to the southward. That's Farrago, I exclaimed, catching sight of a United States flag floating majestically from a bamboo pole. Give me the megaphone, if you please. She handed me the instrument. I hailed the shore, and presently a man appeared under the palms at the water's edge. Hello, I roared, trying to interject cheerfulness into the hollow bellow. How are you, Professor? The answer came distinctly across the water. Who is that with you? My lips were buried in the megaphone. I strove to speak. I only produced a ghastly, chuckling sound. Of course you expect to tell the truth, observed the pretty stenographer quietly. I removed my lips from the megaphone and looked around at her. She returned my gaze with a disturbing smile. I want to mitigate the blow, I said hoarsely. Tell me how. I'm sure I don't know, she said sweetly. Well, I do, I fairly barked, and seizing the megaphone again, I set it to my lips and roared, My fiancé! Good gracious, exclaimed Miss Barrison in consternation. I thought you were going to tell the truth. Don't do that, or you'll upset us, I snapped. I'm telling the truth. I've engaged myself to you. I did it mentally, before I bellowed. But you know as well as I do what engagements mean, I said, picking up the oars and digging them deep in the blue water. She assented uncertainly. A few minutes more of vigorous rowing brought us to a muddy landing under a cluster of tall palmettos, where a gasoline launch lay. Professor Farrago came down to the shore as I landed, and I walked ahead to meet him. He was the maddest man I ever saw, but I was his match, for I was desperate. What the devil? He began under his breath. Nonsense, I said deliberately. An engaged woman is practically married already, because marriages are made in heaven. Good Lord, he gasped. Are you mad, Gilland? I sent for a stenographer. Miss Barrison is a stenographer, I said calmly, and before he could recover, I had presented him, and left them face to face, washing my hands of the whole affair. Unloading the boat and carrying the luggage up under the palms, I heard her saying, No, I am not in the least afraid of snakes, and I am quite ready to begin my duties. And he, Mr. Gilland is a young man who lacks practical experience. And she, Mr. Gilland has been most thoughtful for my comfort. The journey has been perfectly heavenly. And he, clumsily, The celestial aspect of your journey has doubtless been colored by the prospect of your approaching nuptials. She, hastily, Oh, I do not think so, Professor. Idiot, I murmured, dragging the dog to the shore, where his yelps brought the Professor hurrying. Is that the dog? He inquired, adjusting his spectacles. That's the dog, I said. He's full of points, you see? Oh, mused the Professor. I thought he was full of... He hesitated, inspecting the animal, who, nose to the ground, stood investigating a smell of some sort. See, I said with enthusiasm, he's found a scent. He's trailing it already. Now he's rolling on it. He's rolling on one of our concentrated food lozenges, said the Professor dryly. Tie him up, Mr. Gilland, and ask Mrs. Gilland to come up to camp. Your room is ready. Rooms, I corrected. She isn't Mrs. Gilland yet, I added with a forced smile. But you're practically married, observed the Professor, as you pointed out to me. And if she's practically Mrs. Gilland, why not say so? Don't, all the same, I snarled. But marriages are made in... I cast a desperate eye upon him. From that moment, whenever we were alone together, he made a target of me. I had never supposed him humorously vindictive. He was, and his apparently innocent mistakes almost turned my hair gray. But to Miss Barrison he was kind and courteous, and for a time over-serious. Observing him, I could never detect the slightest symptom of dislike for her sex, a failing which common rumor had always credited him with, to the verge of absolute rudeness. On the contrary, it was perfectly plain to anybody that he liked her. There was in his manner towards her a mixture of business formality and the deferential attitude of a gentleman. We were seated just before sunset, outside of the hut built of palmetto logs, when Professor Farrago, addressing us both, began the explanation of our future duties. Miss Barrison, it appeared, was to note everything said by himself, making several shorthand copies by evening. In other words, she was to report every scrap of conversation she heard while in the Everglades, and she nodded intelligently as he finished, and drew pad and pencil from the pocket of her walking skirt, jotting down his instructions as a beginning. I could see that he was pleased. "The reason I do this," he said, "is because I do not wish to hide anything that transpires while we are on this expedition. Only the most scrupulous minute record can satisfy me. No details are too small to merit record. I demand, and I court, from my fellow scientists, and from the public, the fullest investigation." He smiled slightly, turning towards me. "You know, Mr. Gilland, how dangerous to the reputation of a scientific man is any line of investigation into the unusual. If a man once is even suspected of charlatanism, of sensationalism, of turning his attention to any phenomena not strictly within the proper pale of scientific investigation, that man is doomed to ridicule. His profession disowns him. He becomes a man without honor, without authority. Is it not so?" "Yes," I said. "Therefore," he resumed thoughtfully, "as I do most firmly believe in the course I am now pursuing, whether I succeed or fail, I desire a true and minute record made, hiding nothing of what may be said or done. A stenographer alone can give this to the world, while I can only supplement it with a description of events, if I live to transcribe them." Sunk in profound reverie, he sat there silent under the great smooth palm tree, a venerable figure in his yellow dressing-gown and carpet slippers. Seated side by side, we waited, a trifle awed. I could hear the soft breathing of the pretty stenographer beside me. "First of all," said Professor Farrago, looking up, "I must be able to trust those who are here to aid me." I will be faithful," said the girl in a low voice. "I do not doubt you, my child," he said, "nor you, Gilland, and so I am going to tell you this much now. More, I hope, later." And he sat up straight, lifting an impressive forefinger. "Mr. Rowan, lately an officer of our Coast Survey, wrote me a letter from the Holland House in New York, a letter so strange that, on reading it, I immediately repaired to his hotel, where, for hours, we talked together. The result of that conference is this expedition. I have now been here 2 months, and I am satisfied of certain facts. First, there do exist in this unexplored wilderness certain forms of life which are solid and palpable, but transparent and practically invisible. Second, these living creatures belong to the animal kingdom, are warm-blooded vertebrates, possess powers of locomotion, but whether that of flight I am not certain. Third, they appear to possess such senses as we enjoy: smell, touch, sight, hearing, and no doubt the sense of taste. Fourth, their skin is smooth to the touch, and the temperature of the epidermis appears to approximate that of a normal human being. Fifth, and last, whether bipeds or quadrupeds, I do not know, though all evidence appears to confirm my theory that they walk erect. One pair of their limbs appear to terminate in a sort of foot, like a delicately shaped human foot, except that there appear to be no toes. The other pair of limbs terminate in something that, from the single instance I experienced, seemed to resemble soft but firm antennae, or perhaps digitated feelers, I blurted out. I don't know, but I think so. Once, when I was standing in the forest, perfectly aware that creatures I could not see had stealthily surrounded me, the tension was brought to a crisis when over my face, from cheek to chin, stole a soft something, brushing the skin as delicately as a child's fingers might brush it. "Good Lord!" I breathed. A careworn smile crept into his eyes. "A test for nerves, you think, Mr. Gilland? I agree with you. Nobody fears what anybody can see." There came the slightest movement beside me. "Are you trembling?" I asked, turning. "I was writing," she replied steadily. "Did my elbow touch you?" "By the way," said Professor Farrago, "I fear I forgot to congratulate you upon your choice of stenographer, Mr. Gilland." A rosy light stole over her pale face. "Am I to record that, too?" she asked, raising her blue eyes. "Certainly," he replied gravely. "But, Professor," I began, a prey to increasing excitement, "do you propose to attempt the capture of one of these animals?" "That is what the cage is for," he said. "I supposed you had guessed that." "I had," murmured the pretty stenographer. "I do not doubt it," said Professor Farrago gravely. "What are the chemicals for, and the tank and hose attachment?" "Think, Mr. Gilland." "I can't. I'm almost stunned by what you tell me." He laughed. "The rhodium oxide and salts of strontium are to be dumped into the tank together. They'll effervesce, of course." "Of course," I muttered. "And I can throw a rose-colored spray over any object by the hose attachment, can't I?" "Yes." "Well, I tried it on a transparent jellyfish, and it became perfectly visible and of a beautiful rose color. And I tried it on rock crystal, and on glass, and on pure gelatin, and all became suffused with a delicate pink glow, which lasted for hours or minutes according to the substance. Now you understand, don't you?" "Yes. You want to see what sort of creature you have to deal with." "Exactly. So when I've trapped it, I'm going to spray it." He turned half humorously towards the stenographer. "I fancy you understood long before Mr. Gilland did." "I don't think so," she said with a sidelong lifting of the heavy lashes, and I caught the color of her eyes for a second. "You see how Miss Barrison spares your feelings," observed Professor Farrago dryly. "She owes you little gratitude for bringing her here, yet she proves a generous victim." "Oh, I am very grateful for this rarest of chances," she said shyly. "To be among the first in the world to discover such wonders ought to make me very grateful to the man who gave me the opportunity." "Do you mean Mr. Gilland?" asked the professor, laughing. I had never before seen Professor Farrago laugh such a carefree laugh. I had never suspected him of harboring even an embryo of the social graces. Dry as dust, sapless as steel, precise as the magnetic needle, he had hitherto been to me the mummified embodiment of science militant. Now, in the guise of a perfectly human and genial old gentleman, I scarcely recognized my superior of the Bronx Park Society. And as a woman-hater, he was a miserable failure. Heavens, I thought to myself, am I becoming jealous of my revered professor's social success with a stray stenographer? I felt mean, and I probably looked it, and I was glad that telepathy did not permit Miss Barrison to record my secret and unworthy ruminations. The professor was saying, "These transparent creatures break off berries and fruits and branches. I have seen a flower, too, plucked from its stem by invisible digits and borne swiftly through the forest, only the flower visible, apparently speeding through the air and out of sight among the thickets. I have found the footprints that I described to you, usually on the edge of a stream or in the soft loam along some forest lake or lost lagoon. Again and again I have been conscious in the forest that unseen eyes were fixed on me, that unseen shapes were following me. Never but that one time did these invisible creatures close in around me and venture to touch me. They may be weak, their structure may be frail, and they may be incapable of violence or harm, but the depth of the footprints indicate a weight of at least 130 pounds, and it certainly requires some muscular strength to break off a branch of wild guavas. He bent his noble head, thoughtfully regarding the design of his slippers. "What was the rifle for?" I asked. "Defense, not aggression," he said simply. "And the camera?" "A camera record is necessary in these days of bad artists." I hesitated, glancing at Miss Barrison. She was still writing, her pretty head bent over the pad in her lap. "And the clothing?" I asked carelessly. "Did you get it?" he demanded. "Of course." I glanced at Miss Barrison. "There's no use writing down everything, is there?" "Everything must be recorded," said Professor Farrago inflexibly. "What clothing did you buy?" "I forgot the gown," I said, getting red about the ears. "Forgot the gown," he repeated. "Yes, one kind of gown, the day kind. I got the other kind." He was annoyed. So was I. After a moment he got up, and, crossing to the log cabin, opened up one of the boxes of apparel. "Is it what you wanted?" I inquired. "Yes, I presume so," he replied, visibly perplexed. "It's the best to be had," said I. "That's quite right," he said musingly. "We use only the best of everything at Bronx Park. It is traditional with us, you know." Curiosity pushed me. "Well, what on earth is it for?" I broke out. He looked at me gravely over the tops of his spectacles, a striking and inspiring figure in his yellow flannel dressing gown and slippers. "I shall tell you some day, perhaps," he said mildly. "Good night, Miss Barrison." "Good night, Mr. Gilland. You will find extra blankets on your bunk." "What?" I cried. "Bunks," he said, and shut the door. Chapter 16. "There is something weird about this whole proceeding," I observed to the pretty stenographer next morning. "These pies will be weird if you don't stop talking to me," she said, opening the doors of Professor Farrago's portable camping oven and peeping in at the fragrant pastry. The professor had gone off somewhere into the woods early that morning. As he was not in the habit of talking to himself, the services of Miss Barrison were not required. Before he started, however, he came to her with a request for a dozen pies, the construction of which he asked if she understood. She had been to cooking school in more prosperous days, and she mentioned it. So at his earnest solicitation she undertook to bake for him 12 apple pies, and she was now attempting it, assisted by advice from me. "Are they burned?" I asked, sniffing the air. "No, they are not burned, Mr. Gilland, but my finger is," she retorted, stepping back to examine the damage. I offered sympathy and witch hazel, but she would have none of my offerings, and presently returned to her pies. "We can't eat all that pastry," I protested. "Professor Farrago said they were not for us to eat," she said, dusting each pie with powdered sugar. "Well, what are they for? The dog? Or are they simply objects d'art to adorn the shanty?" "You annoy me," she said. "The pies annoy me. Won't you tell me what they're for?" "I have a pretty fair idea what they're for," she observed, tossing her head. "Haven't you?" "No. What?" "These pies are for bait." "To bait hooks with?" I exclaimed. "Hooks? No, you silly man. They're for baiting the cage. He means to trap these transparent creatures in a cage baited with pie." She laughed scornfully, inserted the burned tip of her finger in her mouth, and stood looking at me defiantly, like a flushed and bright-eyed schoolgirl. "You think you're teasing me," she said, "but do you not realize what a singularly slow-minded young man you are?" I stopped laughing. "How did you come to the conclusion that pies were to be used for such a purpose?" I asked. "I deduce," she observed, with an airy wave of her disengaged hand. "Your deductions are weird, like everything else in this vicinity. Pies to catch invisible monsters. Pfft!" "You're not particularly complimentary, are you?" she said. "Not particularly, but I could be, with you for my inspiration. I could even be enthusiastic." "About my pies?" "No, about your eyes." "You are very frivolous for a scientist," she said scornfully. "Please subdue your enthusiasm and bring me some wood. This fire is almost out." When I had brought the wood, she presented me with a pail of hot water and pointed at the dishes on the breakfast table. "Never!" I cried, revolted. "Then I suppose I must do them." She looked pensively at her scorched fingertip, and, pursing up her red lips, blew a gentle breath to cool it. "I'll do the dishes," I said. Splashing and slushing the cups and saucers about in the hot water, I reflected upon the events of the last few days. The dog, stupefied by unwonted abundance of food, lay in the sunshine, sleeping the sleep of repletion. The pretty stenographer, all rosy from her culinary exertions, was removing the pies and setting them in neat rows to cool. "There," she said with a sigh. "Now I will dry the dishes for you. You didn't mention the fact, when you engaged me, that I was also expected to do general housework." "I didn't engage you," I said maliciously. "You engaged me, you know." She regarded me disdainfully, nose up-tilted. "How thoroughly disagreeable you can be," she said. "Dry your own dishes. I'm going for a stroll." "May I join you?" "You may not. I shall go so far that you cannot possibly discover me." I watched her forestward progress. She sauntered for about 30 yards along the lake, and presently sat down, in plain sight, under a huge live oak. A few minutes later I had completed my task as general bottle washer, and I cast about for something to occupy me. First I approached and politely caressed the satiated dog. He woke up, regarded me with dully meditative eyes, yawned, and went to sleep again. Never a flop of tail to indicate gratitude for blandishments, never the faintest symptom of canine appreciation. Chilled by my reception, I moused about for a while, poking into boxes and bundles, then raised my head and inspected the landscape. Through the vista of trees, the pink shirtwaist of the pretty stenographer glimmered like a rose blooming in the wilderness. From whatever point I viewed the prospect, that pink spot seemed to intrude. I turned my back and examined the jungle, but there it was repeated in 100 pink blossoms among the massed thickets. I looked up into the treetops, where pink mosses spotted the palms. I looked out over the lake, and I saw it in my mind's eye, pinker than ever. It was certainly a case of pink eye. "I'll go for a stroll, too. It's a free country," I muttered. After I'd strolled in a complete circle, I found myself within 3 feet of a pink shirtwaist. "I beg your pardon," I said. "I had no intent—" "I thought you were never coming," she said amiably. "How is your finger?" I asked. She held it up. I took it gingerly. It was smooth and faintly rosy at the tip. "Does it hurt?" I inquired. "Dreadfully. Your hands feel so cool." After a silence, she said, "Thank you. That has cooled the burning." "I am determined," said I, "to expel the fire from your finger if it takes hours and hours." And I seated myself with that intention. For a while she talked, making innocent observations concerning the tropical foliage surrounding us. Then silence crept in between us, accentuated by the brooding stillness of the forest. "I'm afraid your hands are growing tired," she said considerately. I denied it. Through the vista of palms we could see the lake, blue as a violet, sparkling with silvery sunshine. In the intense quiet, the splash of leaping mullet sounded distinctly. Once a tall crane stalked into view among the sedges. Once an unseen alligator shook the silence with his deep hollow roaring. Then the stillness of the wilderness grew more intense. We had been sitting there for a long while without exchanging a word, dreamily watching the ripple of the azure water, when all at once there came a scurrying patter of feet through the forest, and, looking up, I beheld the hound dog, tail between his legs, bearing down at us at lightning speed. I rose instantly. "What is the matter with the dog?" cried the pretty stenographer. "Is he going mad, Mr. Gilland?" "Something has scared him," I exclaimed, as the dog, eyes like lighted candles, rushed frantically between my legs and buried his head in Miss Barrison's lap. "Poor doggie," she said, smoothing the collapsed pup. "Poor, poor little beast. Did anything scare him? Tell Auntie all about it." When a dog flees without yelping, he's a badly frightened creature. I instinctively started back towards the camp whence the beast had fled, and before I had taken a dozen steps, Miss Barrison was beside me, carrying the dog in her arms. "I've an idea," she said, under her breath. "What?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the camp. "It's this. I'll wager that we find those pies gone." "Pies gone?" I repeated, perplexed. "What makes you think—" "They are gone," she exclaimed. "Look." I gaped stupidly at the rough pine table where the pies had stood in 3 neat rows of 4 each. And then, in a moment, the purport of this robbery flashed upon my senses. "The transparent creatures!" I gasped. "Hush!" she whispered, clinging to the trembling dog in her arms. I listened. I could hear nothing, see nothing, yet slowly I became convinced of the presence of something unseen, something in the forest close by, watching us out of invisible eyes. A chill, settling along my spine, crept upward to my scalp, until every separate hair wiggled to the roots. Miss Barrison was pale, but perfectly calm and self-possessed. "Let us go indoors," I said, as steadily as I could. "Very well," she replied. I held the door open. She entered with the dog. I followed, closing and barring the door, and then took my station at the window, rifle in hand. There was not a sound in the forest. Miss Barrison laid the dog on the floor and quietly picked up her pad and pencil. Presently she was deep in a report of the phenomena, her pencil flying, leaf after leaf from the pad fluttering to the floor. Nor did I, at the window, change my position of scared alertness until I was aware of her hand gently touching my elbow to attract my attention, and her soft voice at my ear. "You don't suppose by any chance that the dog ate those pies?" I collected my tumultuous thoughts and turned to stare at the dog. 12 pies, 12 inches each in diameter, she reflected musingly. 1 dog, 20 inches in diameter. How many times will the pies go into the dog? Let me see. She made a few figures on her pad, thought a while, produced a tape measure from her pocket, and, kneeling down, measured the dog. "No," she said, looking up at me, "he couldn't contain them." Inspired by her coolness and perfect composure, I set the rifle in the corner and opened the door. Sunlight fell in bars through the quiet woods. Nothing stirred on land or water save the great yellow-striped butterflies that fluttered and soared and floated above the flowering thickets bordering the jungle. The heat became intense. Miss Barrison went to her room to change her gown for a lighter one. I sat down under a live oak, eyes and ears strained for any sign of our invisible neighbors. When she emerged in the lightest and flimsiest of summer gowns, she brought the camera with her, and for a while we took pictures of each other until we had used up all but one film. Desiring to possess a picture of Miss Barrison and myself seated together, I tied a string to the shutter lever and attached the other end of the string to the dog, who had resumed his interrupted slumbers. At my whistle, he jumped up nervously, snapping the lever, and the picture was taken. With such innocent and harmless pastime, we whiled away the afternoon. She made 12 more apple pies. I mounted guard over them, and we were just beginning to feel a trifle uneasy about Professor Farrago when he appeared, tramping sturdily through the forest, green umbrella and butterfly net under one arm, shotgun and cyanide jar under the other, and his breast all crisscrossed with straps, from which dangled field glasses, collecting boxes, and botanizing tins. An inspiring figure indeed, the embodied symbol of science indomitable, triumphant. We hailed him with 3 guilty cheers. The dog woke up with a perfunctory bark, the first sound I had heard from him since he yelped his disapproval of me on the lagoon. Miss Barrison produced 3 bowls full of boiling water and dropped 3 pellets of concentrated soup meat into them, while I prepared coffee. And in a few moments our simple dinner was ready. The red ants had been dusted from the biscuits, the spiders chased off the baked beans, the scorpions shaken from the napkins, and we sat down at the rough improvised table under the palms. The professor gave us a brief but modest account of his short tour of exploration. He had brought back a new species of orchid, several undescribed beetles, and a pocket full of coontie seed. He appeared, however, to be tired and singularly depressed, and presently we learned why. It seemed that he had gone straight to that section of the forest where he had hitherto always found signs of the transparent and invisible creatures which he had determined to capture, and he had not found a single trace of them. "It alarms me," he said gravely. "If they have deserted this region, it might take a lifetime to locate them again in this wilderness." Then, very quietly, sinking her voice instinctively, as though the unseen might be at our very elbows listening, Miss Barrison recounted the curious adventure which had befallen the dog and the first batch of apple pies. With visible and increasing excitement, the professor listened until the very end. Then he struck the table with clenched fist, a resounding blow which set the concentrated soup dancing in the bowls and scattered the biscuits and the industrious red ants in every direction. "Eureka!" he whispered. "Miss Barrison, your deduction was not only perfectly reasonable, but brilliant. You are right. The pies are for that very purpose. I conceived the idea when I first came here. Again and again, the pies that my guide made out of dried apples disappeared in a most astonishing and mysterious manner when left to cool. At length, I determined to watch them every second, and did so, with the result that late one afternoon I was amazed to see a pie slowly rise from the table and move swiftly away through the air, about 4 feet above the ground, finally disappearing into a tangle of jasmine and grapevine. The apparently automatic flight of that pie solved the problem. These transparent creatures cannot resist that delicacy. Therefore, I decided to bait the cage for them this very night. Look, what's the matter with that dog?" The dog suddenly bounded into the air, alighted on all 4s, ears, eyes, and muzzle, concentrated on a point directly behind us. "Good gracious, the pies!" faltered Miss Barrison, half rising from her seat, but the dog rushed madly into her skirts, scrambling for protection, and she fell back almost into my arms. Clasping her tightly, I looked over my shoulder. The last pie was snatched from the table before my eyes, and I saw it borne swiftly away by something unseen, straight into the deepening shadows of the forest. The professor was singularly calm, even slightly ironical, as he turned to me, saying, "Perhaps if you relinquish Miss Barrison, she may be able to free herself from that dog." I did so immediately, and she deposited the cowering dog in my arms. Her face had suddenly become pink. I passed the dog on to Professor Farrago, dumping it viciously into his lap, a proceeding which struck me as resembling a pastime of extreme youth known as "Button, button, who's got the button?" The professor examined the animal gravely, feeling its pulse, counting its respirations, and finally inserting a tentative finger in an attempt to examine its tongue. The dog bit him. "Ouch! It's a clear case of fright," he said gravely. "I wanted a dog to aid me in trailing these remarkable creatures, but I think this dog of yours is useless, Gilland." "It's given us warning of the creature's presence twice already," I argued. "Poor little thing," said Miss Barrison softly. "I don't know why, but I love that dog. He has eyes like yours, Mr. Gilland." Exasperated, I rose from the table. "He's got eyes like holes burned in a blanket," I said, "and if ever a flicker of intelligence lighted them, I have failed to observe it." The professor regarded me dreamily. "We ought to have more pies," he observed. "Perhaps if you carried the oven into the shanty." "Certainly," said Miss Barrison. "We can lock the door while I make 12 more pies." I carried the portable camping oven into the cabin, connected the patent asbestos chimney pipes, and lighted the fire. And in a few minutes, Miss Barrison, sleeves rolled up and pink apron pinned under her chin, was busily engaged in rolling pie crust, while Professor Farrago measured out spices and set the dried apples to soak. The swift southern twilight had already veiled the forest as I stepped out of the cabin to smoke a cigar and promenade a bit and cogitate. A last trace of color lingering in the west faded out as I looked. The gray glimmer deepened into darkness, through which the white lake vapors floated in thin wavering strata across the water. For a while, the frog's symphony dominated all other sounds. Then lagoon and forest and cypress branch awoke, and through the steadily sustained tumult of woodland voices, I could hear the dry bark of the fox squirrel, the whistle of the raccoon, ducks softly quacking or whimpering as they prepared for sleep among the reeds, the soft booming of bitterns, the clattering gossip of the heronry, the southern whippoorwill's incessant call. At regular intervals, the howling note of a lone heron echoed the strident screech of a crimson-crested crane. The horned owl's savage hunting cry haunted the night, now near, now floating from infinite distances. And after a while I became aware of a nearer sound, low-pitched but ceaseless, the hum of thousands of lesser living creatures blending into a steady monotone. Then the theatrical moon came up through filmy draperies of waving Spanish moss, thin as cobwebs, and far in the wilderness a cougar fell a-crying and coughing like a little child with a bad cold. I went in after that. Miss Barrison was sitting before the oven, knees gathered in her clasped hands, languidly studying the fire. She looked up as I appeared, opened the oven doors, sniffed the aroma, and resumed her attitude of contented indifference. "Where is the professor?" I asked. "He has retired. He's been talking in his sleep at moments." "Better take it down. That's what you're here for," I observed, closing and holding the outside door. "Ugh! There's a chill in the air. The dew is pelting down from the pines like a steady fall of rain." "You will get fever if you roam about at night," she said. "Mercy, your coat is soaking. Sit here by the fire." So I pulled up a bench and sat down beside her like the traditional spider. "Miss Muffet," I said, "don't let me frighten you away." "I was going anyhow." "Please don't." "Why?" she demanded, reseating herself. "Because I like to sit beside you," I said truthfully. "Your avowal is startling and not to be substantiated by facts," she remarked, resting her chin on one hand and gazing into the fire. "You mean because I went for a stroll by moonlight. I did that because you always seem to make fun of me as soon as the professor joins us." "Make fun of you? You surely don't expect me to make eyes at you." There was a silence. I toasted my shins thoughtfully. "How is your burned finger?" I asked. She lifted it for my inspection, and I began a protracted examination. "What would you prescribe?" she inquired, with an absent-minded glance at the professor's closed door. "I don't know. Perhaps a slight but firm pressure of the fingertips." "You tried that this afternoon." "But the dog interrupted us." "Interrupted you? Besides—" "What?" "I don't think you ought to," she said. Sitting there before the oven, side by side, hand innocently clasped in hand, we heard the drumming of the dew on the roof, the night wind stirring the palms, the muffled snoring of the professor, the faint whisper and crackle of the fire. A single candle burned brightly, piling our shadows together on the wall behind us. Moonlight silvered the window panes, over which crawled multitudes of soft-winged moths, attracted by the candle within. "See their tiny eyes glow," she whispered, "how their wings quiver, and all for a candle flame. Alas, alas, fire is the undoing of us all." She leaned forward, resting as though buried in reverie, After a while, she extended one foot a trifle, and, with the point of her shoe, carefully unlatched the oven door. As it swung outward, a delicious fragrance filled the room. "They're done," she said, withdrawing her hand from mine. "Help me to lift them out." Together we arranged the delicious pastry in rows on the bench to cool. I opened the door for a few minutes, then closed and bolted it again. "Do you suppose those transparent creatures will smell the odor and come around the cabin?" she suggested, wiping her fingers on her handkerchief. I walked to the window uneasily. Outside the pane, the moths crawled, some brilliant in scarlet and tan color set with black, some snow-white with black tracings on their wings and bodies, peacock blue-edged with orange. The scientist in me was aroused. I called her to the window, and she came and leaned against the sill, nose pressed to the glass. "I don't suppose you know that the antennae of that silvery-winged moth are distinctly pectinate," I said. "Of course I do," she said. "I took my degree as D.E. at Barnard College." "What?" I exclaimed in astonishment. "You've been through Barnard? You're a doctor of entomology?" "It was my undoing," she said. "The department was abolished the year I graduated. There was no similar vacancy, even in the Smithsonian." She shrugged her shoulders, eyes fixed on the moths. "I had to make my own living. I chose stenography as the quickest road to self-sustenance." She looked up, a flush on her cheeks. "I suppose you took me for an inferior," she said. "But do you suppose I'd flirt with you if I was?" She pressed her face to the pane again, murmuring that exquisite poem of Andrew Lang. "Spooning is innocuous and needn't have a sequel, but recollect, if spoon you must, spoon only with your equal." Standing there, watching the moths, we became rather silent. I don't know why. The fire in the range had gone out. The candle flame, flaring above a saucer of melted wax, sank lower and lower. Suddenly, as though disturbed by something inside, the moths all left the window pane, darting off in the darkness. "That's curious," I said. "What's curious?" she asked, opening her eyes languidly. "Good gracious, was that a bat that beat on the window?" "I saw nothing," I said, disturbed. "Listen." A soft sound against the glass, as though invisible fingers were feeling the pane, a gentle rubbing, then a tap-tap, all but inaudible. "Is it a bird? Can you see?" she whispered. The candle flame behind us flashed and expired. Moonlight flooded the pane. The sounds continued, but there was nothing there. We understood now what it was that so gently rubbed and patted the glass outside. With one accord, we noiselessly gathered up the pies and carried them into my room. Then she walked to the door of her room, turned, held out her hand, and whispering, "Good night, à demain, monsieur," slipped into her room and softly closed the door. All night long I lay in troubled slumber beside the pies, a rifle resting on the blankets beside me, a revolver under my pillow. And I dreamed of moths with brilliant eyes and vast silvery wings, harnessed to a balloon in which Miss Barrison and I sat, arms around each other, eating slice after slice of apple pie. Chapter 17. Dawn came, the dawn of a day that I am destined never to forget. Long rosy streamers of light broke through the forest, shaking, quivering, like unstable beams from celestial searchlights. Mist floated upward from marsh and lake, and through it the spectral palms loomed, drooping fronds embroidered with dew. For a while, the ringing outburst of bird music dominated all, but it soon ceased, with dropping notes from the crimson cardinals repeated in lengthening minor intervals. And then the spell of silence returned, broken only by the faint splash of mullet, mocking the sun with sinuous silver flashes. "Good morning," said a low voice from the door as I stood encouraging the campfire with splinter wood and dead palmetto fans. Fresh and sweet from her toilet as a dew-drenched rose, Miss Barrison stood there, sniffing the morning air daintily, thoroughly. "Too much perfume," she said. "Too much like ylang-ylang in a department store. Central Park smells sweeter on an April morning." "Are you criticizing the wild jasmine?" I asked. "I'm criticizing an exotic smell. Am I not permitted to comment on the tropics?" Fishing out a cedar log from the lumber sack, I fell to chopping it vigorously. The axe strokes made a cheerful racket through the woods. "Did you hear anything last night after you retired?" I asked. Something was at my window, something that thumped softly and seemed to be feeling all over the glass. To tell you the truth, I was silly enough to remain dressed all night. "You don't look it," I said. "Oh, when daylight came, I had a chance," she added, laughing. "All the same," said I, leaning on the axe and watching her, "you are about the coolest and pluckiest woman I ever knew." "We were all in the same fix," she said modestly. "No, we were not. Now I'll tell you the truth. My hair stood up the greater part of the night. You are looking upon a poltroon, Miss Barrison." "Then there was something at your window, too." "Something! A dozen! They were monkeying with the sashes and panes all night long, and I imagined that I could hear them breathing, as though from effort of intense eagerness. Ouch! I came as near losing my nerve as I care to. I came within an ace of hurling those cursed pies through the window at them. I'd bolt today if I wasn't afraid to play the coward." "Most people are brave for that reason," she said. The dog, who had slept under my bunk and who had contributed to my entertainment by sighing and moaning all night, now appeared ready for business. Business, in his case, being the operation of feeding. I presented him with a concentrated tablet, which he cautiously investigated and then rolled on. "Nice testimonial for the people who concocted it," I said in disgust. "I wish I had an egg." "There are some concentrated egg tablets in the shanty," said Miss Barrison, but the idea was not attractive. "I refuse to fry a pill for breakfast," I said sullenly, and set the coffee pot on the coals. In spite of the dewy beauty of the morning, breakfast was not a cheerful function. Professor Farrago appeared, clad in sun helmet and khaki. I had seldom seen him depressed, but he was now, and his very efforts to disguise it only emphasized his visible anxiety. His preparations for the day, too, had an ominous aspect to me. He gave his orders, and we obeyed, instinctively suppressing questions. First, he and I transported all personal luggage of the company to the big electric launch, Miss Barrison's effects, his and my own. His private papers, the stenographic reports, and all memoranda were tied up together and carried aboard. Then, to my surprise, 2 weeks' concentrated rations for 2, and mineral water sufficient for the same period, were stowed away aboard the launch. Several times he asked me whether I knew how to run the boat, and I assured him that I did. In a short time, nothing was left ashore except the bare furnishings of the cabin, the female wearing apparel, the steel cage and chemicals which I had brought, and the 12 apple pies, the latter under lock and key in my room. As the preparations came to an end, the professor's gentle melancholy seemed to deepen. Once I ventured to ask him if he was indisposed, and he replied that he had never felt in better physical condition. Presently he made me fetch the pies, and I brought them, and, at a sign from him, placed them inside the steel cage, closing and locking the door. "I believe," he said, glancing from Miss Barrison to me, and from me to the dog, "I believe that we are ready to start." He went to the cabin and locked the door on the outside, pocketing the key. Then he backed up to the steel cage, stooped and lifted his end as I lifted mine, and together we started off through the forest, bearing the cage between us as porters carry a heavy piece of luggage. Miss Barrison came next, carrying the trousseau, the tank hose and chemicals, and the dog followed her, probably not from affection for us, but because he was afraid to be left alone. We walked in silence, the professor and I keeping an instinctive lookout for snakes, but we encountered nothing of that sort. On every side, touching our shoulders, crowded the closely woven and impenetrable tangle of the jungle, and we threaded it along a narrow path which he, no doubt, had cut, for the machete marks were still fresh, and the blazes on hickory, live oak, and palm were all wet with dripping sap and swarming with eager, brilliant butterflies. At times, across our course, flowed shallow, rapid streams of water, clear as crystal and most alluring to the thirsty. "There's fever in every drop," said the professor, as I mentioned my thirst. "Take the bottled water if you mean to stay a little longer." "Stay where?" I asked. "On Earth," he replied tersely, and we marched on. The beauty of the tropics is marred somewhat for me. Under all the fresh splendor of color, death lurks in brilliant tints. Where painted fruit hangs temptingly, where great silky blossoms exhale alluring scent, where the elaps coils, inlaid with scarlet, black, and saffron, where in the shadow of a palmetto frond a succession of velvety black diamonds mark the rattler's swollen length, there is death. And his invisible consort, horror, creeps where the snake whose mouth is lined with white creeps, where the tarantula squats, hairy, motionless, where a bit of living enamel, fringed with orange, undulates along a mossy log. Thinking of these things, and watchful lest, unawares, terror unfold from some blossoming and leafy covert, I scarcely noticed the beauty of the glade we had entered. A long oval, cross-barred with sunshine, which fell on hedges of scrub palmetto, chin-high, interlaced with golden blossoms of the jasmine, and all around, like pillars, supporting a high green canopy above a throne, towered the silvery stems of palms, fretted with pale, rose-tinted lichens, and hung with draperies of grapevine. "This is the place," said Professor Farrago. His quiet, passionless voice sounded strange to me. His words seemed strange too, each one heavily weighted with hidden meaning. We set the cage on the ground. He unlocked and opened the steel-barred door, and, kneeling, carefully arranged the pies along the center of the cage. "I have a curious presentiment," he said, "that I shall not come out of this experiment unscathed." "Don't, for heaven's sake, say that!" I broke out, my nerves on edge again. "Why not?" he asked, surprised. "I am not afraid." "Not afraid to die?" I demanded, exasperated. "Who spoke of dying?" he inquired mildly. "What I said was that I do not expect to come out of this affair unscathed." I did not comprehend his meaning, but I understood the reproof conveyed. He closed and locked the cage door again and came towards us, balancing the key across the palm of his hand. Miss Barrison had seated herself on the leaves. I stood back as the professor sat down beside her. Then, at a gesture from him, took the place he indicated on his left. "Before we begin," he said calmly, "there are several things you ought to know and which I have not yet told you. The first concerns the feminine wearing apparel which Mr. Gilland brought me." He turned to Miss Barrison and asked her whether she had brought a complete outfit, and she opened the bundle on her knees and handed it to him. "I cannot," he said, "delicately explain in so many words what use I expect to make of this apparel, nor do I yet know whether I shall have any use at all for it. That can only be a theoretical speculation until, within a few more hours, my theory is proven or disproven. And," he said, suddenly turning on me, "my theory concerning these invisible creatures is the most extraordinary and audacious theory ever entertained by man since Columbus presumed that there must lie somewhere a hidden continent which nobody had ever seen." He passed his hand over his protruding forehead, lost for a moment in deepest reflection. Then, "Have you ever heard of the Sphyx?" he asked. It seems to me that Ponce de Leon wrote of something, I began, hesitating. Yes, the famous lines in the 3rd volume which have set so many wise men guessing. You recall them. And there, alas, within the sound of the fountain of youth, whose waters tint the skin till the whole body glows softly like the petal of a rose, there, alas, in the new world already blooming, the eternal enigma I beheld, in the flesh living, yet it faded even as I looked, although I swear it lived and breathed. This is the Sphyx. A silence. Then I said, "Those lines are meaningless to me." "Not to me," said Miss Barrison softly. The professor looked at her. "Ah, child, ever subtler, ever surer. The eternal enigma is no enigma to you." "What is the Sphyx?" I asked. "Have you read De Soto or Goya?" "Yes, both. I remember now that De Soto records the Sayachas legend of the Sphinx, something about a goddess." "Not a goddess," said Miss Barrison, her lips touched with a smile. "Sometimes," said the professor gently. "And Goya said, 'It has come to my ears while in the lands of the Sayachas that the Sphyx surely lives, as bolder and more curious men than I may, God willing, prove to the world hereafter.'" "But what is the Sphyx?" I insisted. "For centuries wise men and savants have asked each other that question. I have answered it for myself. I am now to prove it, I trust." His face darkened, and again he stroked his heavy brow. "If anything occurs," he said, taking my hand in his left and Miss Barrison's hand in his right, "promise me to obey my wishes, will you?" "Yes," we said together. "If I lose my life, or disappear, promise me, on your honor, you'll get to the electric launch as soon as possible and make all speed northward, placing my private papers, the reports of Miss Barrison, and your own reports in the hands of the authorities in Bronx Park. Don't attempt to aid me. Don't delay to search for me. Do you promise?" "Yes," we breathed together. He looked at us solemnly. "If you fail me, you betray me," he said. We swore obedience. "Then let us begin," he said, and he rose and went to the steel cage. Unlocking the door, he flung it wide and stepped inside, leaving the cage door open. "The moment a single pie is disturbed," he said to me, "I shall close the steel door from the inside, and you and Miss Barrison will then dump the rhosium oxide and the strontium into the tank, clap on the lid, turn the nozzle of the hose on the cage, and spray it thoroughly. Whatever is invisible in the cage will become visible and of a faint rose color. And when the trapped creature becomes visible, hold yourselves ready to aid me, as long as I am able to give you orders. After that, either all will go well, or all will go otherwise, and you must run for the launch." He seated himself in the cage near the open door. I placed the steel tank near the cage, uncoiled the hose attachment, unscrewed the top, and dumped in the salts of strontium. Miss Barrison unwrapped the bottle of rhosium oxide and loosened the cork. We examined this pearl and pink powder and shook it up so that it might run out quickly. Then Miss Barrison sat down and presently became absorbed in a stenographic report of the proceedings up to date. When Miss Barrison finished her report, she handed me the bundle of papers. I stowed them away in my wallet, and we sat down together beside the tank. Inside the cage, Professor Farrago was seated, his spectacled eyes fixed on the row of pies. For a while, although realizing perfectly that our quarry was transparent and invisible, we unconsciously strained our eyes in quest of something stirring in the forest. "I should think," said I in a low voice, "that the odor of the pies might draw at least one out of the odd dozen that came rubbing up against my window last night." "Hush! Listen!" she breathed. But we heard nothing save the snoring of the overfed dog at our feet. "He'll give us ample notice by butting into Miss Barrison's skirts," I observed. "No need of our watching, Professor." The professor nodded. Presently he removed his spectacles and lay back against the bars, closing his eyes. At first the forest silence seemed cheerful there in the flecked sunlight. The spotted wood gnats gyrated merrily, chased by dragonflies. The shy woodbirds hopped from branch to twig, peering at us in friendly inquiry. A lithe gray squirrel, plumy tail undulating, rambled serenely about the cage, sniffing at the pastry within. Suddenly, without apparent reason, the squirrel sprang to a tree trunk, hung a moment on the bark, quivering all over, then dashed away into the jungle. "Why did he act like that?" whispered Miss Barrison, and, after a moment, "How still it is! Where have all the birds gone?" In the ominous silence, the dog began to whimper in his sleep, and his hind leg kicked convulsively. "He's dreaming," I began. The words were almost driven down my throat by the dog, who, without a yelp of warning, hurled himself at Miss Barrison and alighted on my chest, forepaws around my neck. I cast him scornfully from me, but he scrambled back, digging like a mole to get under us. "The transparent creatures," whispered Miss Barrison. "Look, see that pie move." I sprang to my feet, just as the professor, jamming on his spectacles, leaned forward and slammed the cage door. "I've got one!" he shouted frantically. "There's one in the cage! Turn on that hose!" "Wait a second," said Miss Barrison, calmly, uncorking the bottle and pouring a pearly stream of rhosium oxide into the tank. "Quick, it's fizzing. Screw on the top." In a second I had screwed the top fast, seized the hose, and directed a hissing cloud of vapor through the cage bars. For a moment nothing was heard save the whistling rush of the perfumed spray escaping. A delicious odor of roses filled the air. Then, slowly, there in the sunshine, a misty something grew in the cage, a glistening, pearl-tinted phantom, imperceptibly taking shape in space. Vague at first as a shred of lake vapor, then lengthening, rounding into flowing form, clearer, clearer. "The Sphyx!" gasped the professor. "In the name of heaven, play that hose!" As he spoke, the treacherous hose burst. A showery pillar of rose-colored vapor enveloped everything. Through the thickening fog, for one brief instant, a human form appeared like magic. A woman's form, flawless, exquisite as a statue, pure as marble. Then the swimming vapor buried it, cage, pies, and all. We ran frantically around, the cage in the obscurity, appealing for instructions and feeling for the bars. Once the professor's muffled voice was heard demanding the wearing apparel, and I groped about and found it, and stuffed it through the bars of the cage. "Do you need help?" I shouted. There was no response. Staring around through the thickening vapor of rhosium, rolling in clouds from the overturned tank, I heard Miss Barrison's voice calling. "I can't move. A transparent lady is holding me." Blindly I rushed about, arms outstretched, and the next moment struck the door of the cage so hard that the impact almost knocked me senseless. Clutching it to steady myself, it suddenly flew open. A rush of partly visible creatures passed me like a burst of pink flames, and in the midst, borne swiftly away on the crest of the outrush, the professor passed like a bolt shot from a catapult, and his last cry wafted back to me from the forest as I swayed there, drunk with the stupefying perfume. "Don't worry, I'm all right." I staggered out into the clearer air towards a figure seen dimly through swirling vapor. "Are you hurt?" I stammered, clasping Miss Barrison in my arms. "No, oh no," she said, wringing her hands. "But the professor, I saw him. I could not scream. I could not move. They had him." "I saw him too," I groaned. There was not one trace of terror on his face. He was actually smiling. Overcome at the sublime courage of the man, we wept in each other's arms. True to our promise to Professor Farrago, we made the best of our way northward, and it was not a difficult journey by any means, the voyage in the launch across Okeechobee being perfectly simple, and the trail to the nearest railroad station but a few easy miles from the landing place. Shocking as had been our experience, dreadful as was the calamity which had not only robbed me of a lifelong friend, but had also bereaved the entire scientific world, I could not seem to feel that desperate and hopeless grief which the natural decease of a close friend might warrant. No, there remained a vague expectancy which so dominated my sorrow that at moments I became hopeful, nay, sanguine, that I should one day again behold my beloved superior in the flesh. There was something so happy in his last smile, something so artlessly pleased, that I was certain no fear of impending dissolution worried him as he disappeared into the uncharted depth of the unknown Everglades. I think Miss Barrison agreed with me too. She appeared to be more or less dazed, which was, of course, quite natural, and during our return voyage across Okeechobee and through the lagoons and forests beyond, she was very silent. When we reached the railroad at Portulaca, a thrifty lemon-growing ranch on the Volusia and Chinkapin Railway, the first thing I did was to present my dog to the station agent. But I was obliged to give him $5 before he consented to accept the dog. However, Miss Barrison interviewed the station master's wife, a kindly, pitiful soul who promised to be a good mistress to the creature. We both felt better after that was off our minds. We felt better still when the northbound train rolled leisurely into the white glare of Portulaca, and presently rolled out again, quite as leisurely, bound, thank heaven, for that abused aggregation of sinful boroughs called New York. Except for one young man whom I encountered in the smoker, we had the train to ourselves, a circumstance which, curiously enough, appeared to increase Miss Barrison's depression, and my own as a natural sequence. The circumstances of the taking off of Professor Farrago appeared to engross her thoughts so completely that it made me uneasy during our trip out from Little Sprite. In fact, it was growing plainer to me every hour that in her brief acquaintance with that distinguished scientist, she had become personally attached to him to an extent that began to worry me. Her personal indignation at a caged Sphyx flared out at unexpected intervals, and there could be no doubt that her unhappiness and resentment were becoming morbid. I spent an hour or two in the smoking compartment, tenanted only by a single passenger and myself. He was an agreeable young man, although in the natural acquaintanceship that we struck up, I regretted to learn that he was a writer of popular fiction, returning from Fort Worth, where he had been for the sole purpose of composing a poem on Florida. I have always, in common with other mentally balanced savants, despised writers of fiction. All scientists harbor a natural antipathy to romance in any form, and that antipathy becomes a deep horror if fiction dares to deal flippantly with the exact sciences, or if some degraded intellect assumes the warrantless liberty of using natural history as a vehicle for silly tales. Never but once had I been tempted to romance in any form. Never but once had sentiment interfered with the passionless transfer of scientific notes to the sanctuary of the unvarnished notebook, or the cloister of the juiceless monograph. Nor have I the slightest approach to that superficial and doubtful quality known as literary skill. Once, however, as I sat alone in the middle of the floor, classifying my isopods, I was not only astonished, but totally unprepared, to find myself repeating aloud a verse that I myself had unconsciously fashioned. An isopod is a work of God. Never before in all my life had I made a rhyme, and it worried me for weeks, ringing in my brain day and night, confusing me, interfering with my thoughts. I said as much to the young man, who only laughed good-naturedly and replied that it was the Creator's purpose to limit certain intellects, nobody knows why, and that it was apparent that mine had not escaped. "There's one thing, however," he said, "that might be of some interest to you, and come within the circumscribed scope of your intelligence." "And what is that?" I asked tartly. "A scientific experience of mine," he said, with a careless laugh. "It's so much stranger than fiction that even Professor Bruce Stoddard of Columbia hesitated to credit it." I looked at the young fellow suspiciously. His bland smile disarmed me, but I did not invite him to relate his experience, although he apparently needed only that encouragement to begin. "Now, if I could tell it exactly as it occurred," he observed, "and a stenographer could take it down, word for word, exactly as I relate it." "It would give me great pleasure to do so," said a quiet voice at the door. We rose at once, removing the cigars from our lips, but Miss Barrison bade us continue smoking, and at a gesture from her, we resumed our seats after she had installed herself by the window. "Really," she said, looking at me coldly, "I couldn't endure the solitude any longer. Isn't there anything to do on this tiresome train?" "If you had your pad and pencil," I began maliciously, "you might take down a matter of interest." She looked frankly at the young man, who laughed in that pleasant, good-tempered manner of his, and offered to tell us of his alleged scientific experience, if we thought it might amuse us sufficiently to vary the dull monotony of the journey north. "Is it fiction?" I asked point-blank. "It is absolute truth," he replied. I rose and went off to find pad and pencil. When I returned, Miss Barrison was laughing at a story which the young man had just finished. "But," he ended gravely, "I have practically decided to renounce fiction as a means of livelihood, and confine myself to simple, uninteresting statistics and facts." "I am very glad to hear you say that," I exclaimed warmly. He bowed, looked at Miss Barrison, and asked her when he might begin his story. "Whenever you are ready," replied Miss Barrison, smiling in a manner which I had not observed since the disappearance of Professor Farrago. I'll admit that the young man was superficially attractive. "Well then," he began modestly, "having no technical ability concerning the affair in question, and having no knowledge of either comparative anatomy or zoology, I am perhaps unfitted to tell this story. But the story is true. The episode occurred under my own eyes, within a few hours' sail of the Battery, and I was one of the first persons to verify what has long been a theory among scientists, and, moreover, as the result of Professor Holroyd's discovery is to be placed on exhibition in Madison Square Garden on the 20th of next month, I have decided to tell you, as simply as I am able, exactly what occurred. I first told the story on April 1st, 1903, to the editors of the North American Review, the Popular Science Monthly, the Scientific American, Nature, Outing, and the Fossiliferous Magazine. All these gentlemen rejected it, some curtly informing me that fiction had no place in their columns. When I attempted to explain that it was not fiction, the editors of these periodicals either maintained a contemptuous silence or bluntly notified me that my literary services and opinions were not desired. But finally, when several publishers offered to take the story as fiction, I cut short all negotiations and decided to publish it myself. Where I am known at all, it is my misfortune to be known as a writer of fiction. This makes it impossible for me to receive a hearing from a scientific audience. I regret it bitterly, because now, when it is too late, I am prepared to prove certain scientific matters of interest, and to produce the proofs. In this case, however, I am fortunate, for nobody can dispute the existence of a thing when the bodily proof is exhibited as evidence. This is the story, and if I tell it as I write fiction, it is because I do not know how to tell it otherwise. I was walking along the beach below Pine Inlet, on the south shore of Long Island. The railroad and telegraph station is at West Oyster Bay. Everybody who has traveled on the Long Island Railroad knows that station, but few, perhaps, know Pine Inlet. Duck shooters, of course, are familiar with it, but as there are no hotels there, and nothing to see except Salt Meadow, Salt Creek, and a strip of dune and sand, the summer squatting public may probably be unaware of its existence. The local name for the place is Pine Inlet. The maps give its name as Sand Point, I believe, but anybody at West Oyster Bay can direct you to it. Captain McPeak, who keeps the West Oyster Bay house, drives duck shooters there in winter. It lies 5 miles southeast from West Oyster Bay. I had walked over that afternoon from Captain McPeak's. There was a reason for my going to Pine Inlet. It embarrasses me to explain it, but the truth is, I meditated writing an ode to the ocean. It was out of the question to write it in West Oyster Bay, with the whistle of locomotives in my ears. I knew that Pine Inlet was one of the loneliest places on the Atlantic coast. It is out of sight of everything except leagues of gray ocean. Rarely one might make out fishing smacks drifting across the horizon. Summer squatters never visited it. Sportsmen shunned it, except in winter. Therefore, as I was about to do a bit of poetry, I thought that Pine Inlet was the spot for the deed. So I went there. As I was strolling along the beach, biting my pencil reflectively, tremendously impressed by the solitude and the solemn thunder of the surf, a thought occurred to me. How unpleasant it would be if I suddenly stumbled on a summer boarder. As this joyless impossibility flitted across my mind, I rounded a bleak sand dune. A girl stood directly in my path. She stared at me as though I had just crawled up out of the sea to bite her. I don't know what my own expression resembled, but I have been given to understand it was idiotic. Now I perceived, after a few moments, that the young lady was frightened, and I knew I ought to say something civil, so I said, "Are there many mosquitoes here?" "No," she replied, with a slight quiver in her voice. "I have only seen one, and it was biting somebody else." The conversation seemed so futile, and the young lady appeared to be more nervous than before. I had an impulse to say, "Do not run, I have breakfasted," for she seemed to be meditating a flight into the breakers. What I did say was, "I did not know anybody was here. I do not intend to intrude. I come from Captain McPeak's, and I am writing an ode to the ocean." After I had said this, it seemed to ring in my ears like, "I come from Table Mountain, and my name is Truthful James." I glanced timidly at her. "She's thinking of the same thing," said I to myself. However, the young lady seemed to be a trifle reassured. I noticed she drew a sigh of relief and looked at my shoes. She looked so long that it made me suspicious, and I also examined my shoes. They seemed to be in a fair state of repair. I am sorry," she said, "but would you mind not walking on the beach?" This was sudden. I had intended to retire and leave the beach to her, but I did not fancy being driven away so abruptly. "Dear me," she cried, "you don't understand. I would not think for a moment of asking you to leave Pine Inlet. I merely ventured to request you to walk on the dunes. I'm so afraid that your footprints may obliterate the impressions that my father is studying." "Oh," said I, looking about me as though I had been caught in the middle of a flower bed. "Really, I did not notice any impressions. Impressions of what?" "I don't know," she said, smiling a little at my awkward pose. "If you step this way in a straight line, you can do no damage." I did as she bade me. I suppose my movements resembled the gait of a wet peacock. Possibly they recalled the delicate maneuvers of the kangaroo. Anyway, she laughed. This seriously annoyed me. I had been at a disadvantage. I walk well enough when let alone. "You can scarcely expect," said I, "that a man absorbed in his own ideas could notice impressions on the sand. I trust I have obliterated nothing." As I said this, I looked back at the long line of footprints stretching away in perspective across the sand. They were my own. How large they looked. Was that what she was laughing at? "I wish to explain," she said gravely, looking at the point of her parasol. "I am very sorry to be obliged to warn you, to ask you to forego the pleasure of strolling on a beach that does not belong to me. Perhaps," she continued in sudden alarm, "perhaps this beach belongs to you." "The beach? Oh, no," I said. But you were going to write poems about it." "Only one, and that does not necessitate owning the beach. I have observed," said I frankly, "that the people who own nothing write many poems about it." She looked at me seriously. I write many poems, I added. She laughed doubtfully. Would you rather I went away? I asked politely. My family is respectable, I added, and I told her my name. Oh, then you wrote culled cow's lips and faded fig leaves, and you imitate Maeterlinck, and you... Oh, I know lots of people that you know, she cried, with every symptom of relief, and you know my brother. I am the author, said I, coldly, of Culled Cow's Lips, but Faded Fig Leaves was an earlier work, which I no longer recognize, and I should be grateful to you if you would be kind enough to deny that I ever imitated Maeterlinck. Possibly, I added, he imitates me. She was very quiet, and I saw she was sorry. Never mind, I said magnanimously. You probably are not familiar with modern literature. If I knew your name, I should ask permission to present myself. Why, I am Daisy Holroyd, she said. What? Jack Holroyd's little sister? Little, she cried. I didn't mean that, said I. You know that your brother and I were great friends in Paris. I know, she said significantly. Of course, I said. Jack and I were inseparable. Except when shut in separate cells, said Miss Holroyd coldly. This unfeeling allusion to the unfortunate termination of a Latin Quarter celebration hurt me. The police, I said, were too officious. So Jack says, replied Miss Holroyd demurely. We had unconsciously moved on along the sandhills side by side as we spoke. To think, I repeated, that I should meet Jack's little... Please, she said, you are only 3 years my senior. She opened the sunshade and tipped it over one shoulder. It was white and had spots and posies on it. Jack sends us every new book you write, she observed. I do not approve of some things you write. Modern school, I mumbled. That is no excuse, she said severely. Anthony Trollope didn't do it. The foam spume from the breakers was drifting across the dunes, and the little tip-up snipe ran along the beach and teetered and whistled and spread their white-barred wings for a low, straight flight across the shingle, only to tip and run and sail on again. The salt sea wind whistled and curled through the crested waves, blowing in perfumed puffs across thickets of sweet bay and cedar. As we passed through the crackling, juicy-stemmed marshweed, myriads of fiddler crabs raised their foreclaws in warning and backed away, rustling through the reeds aggressively, protesting. Like millions of pygmy Ajaxes defying the lightning, I said. Miss Holroyd laughed. Now I never imagined that authors were clever except in print, she said. She was a most extraordinary girl. I suppose, she observed, after a moment's silence, I suppose I am taking you to my father. Delighted, I mumbled. I had the honor of meeting Professor Holroyd in Paris. Yes, he bailed you and Jack out, said Miss Holroyd serenely. The silence was too painful to last. Captain McPeak is an interesting man, I said. I spoke more loudly than I intended. I may have been nervous. Yes, said Daisy Holroyd, but he has a most singular hotel clerk. You mean Mr. Frisbee? I do. Yes, I admitted, Mr. Frisbee is queer. He was once a bill poster. I know it, exclaimed Daisy Holroyd, with some heat. He ruins landscapes whenever he has an opportunity. Do you know that he has a passion for bill posting? He has. He posts bills for the pure pleasure of it, just as you play golf or tennis or squash. But he's a hotel clerk now, I said. Nobody employs him to post bills. I know it. He does it all by himself for the pure pleasure of it. Papa has engaged him to come down here for 2 weeks, and I dread it, said the girl. What Professor Holroyd might want of Frisbee, I had not the faintest notion. I suppose Miss Holroyd noticed the bewilderment in my face, for she laughed and nodded her head twice. Not only Mr. Frisbee, but Captain McPeak also, she said. You don't mean to say that Captain McPeak is going to close his hotel, I exclaimed. My trunk was there. It contained guarantees of my respectability. Oh, no, his wife will keep it open, replied the girl. Look, you can see Papa now. He's digging. Where? I blurted out. I remembered Professor Holroyd as a prim, spectacled gentleman, with close-cut, snowy beard and a clerical allure. The man I saw digging wore green goggles, a jersey, a battered sou'wester, and hip boots of rubber. He was delving in the muck of the salt meadow, his face streaming with perspiration, his boots and jersey splashed with unpleasant-looking mud. He glanced up as we approached, shading his eyes with a sunburned hand. "Papa dear," said Miss Holroyd, "here is Jack's friend, whom you bailed out of Mazas." The introduction was startling. I turned crimson with mortification. The professor was very decent about it. He called me by name at once. Then he looked at his spade. It was clear he considered me a nuisance, and wished to go on with his digging. "I suppose," he said, "you are still writing." "A little," I replied, trying not to speak sarcastically. My output had rivaled that of the Duchess, in quantity, I mean. "I seldom read fiction," he said, looking restlessly at the hole in the ground. Miss Holroyd came to my rescue. "That was a charming story you wrote last," she said. "Papa should read it. You really should, Papa. It's all about a fossil." We both looked narrowly at Miss Holroyd. Her smile was guileless. "Fossils," repeated the professor. "Do you care for fossils?" "Very much," said I. Now, I am not perfectly sure what my object was in lying. I looked at Daisy Holroyd's dark-fringed eyes. They were very grave. "Fossils," said I, "are my hobby." I think Miss Holroyd winced a little at this. I did not care. I went on. "I have seldom had the opportunity to study the subject, but as a boy I collected flint arrowheads." "Flint arrowheads," said the professor coldly. "Yes, they were the nearest thing to fossils obtainable," I replied, marveling at my own mendacity. The professor looked into the hole. I also looked. I could see nothing in it. "He's digging for fossils," thought I to myself. "Perhaps," said the professor cautiously, "you might wish to aid me in a little research. That is to say, if you have an inclination for fossils." The double entendre was not lost upon me. "I have read all your books so eagerly," said I, "that to join you, to be of service to you in any research, however difficult and trying, would be an honor and a privilege that I never dared to hope for. That," thought I to myself, "will do its own work." But the professor was still suspicious. How could he help it when he remembered Jack's escapades, in which my name was always blended? Doubtless he was satisfied that my influence on Jack was evil. The contrary was the case too. "Fossils," he said, worrying the edge of the excavation with a spade. "Fossils are not things to be lightly considered." "No, indeed," I protested. "Fossils are the most interesting as well as puzzling things in the world," said he. "They are!" I cried enthusiastically. "But I am not looking for fossils," observed the professor mildly. This was a facer. I looked at Daisy Holroyd. She bit her lip and fixed her eyes on the sea. Her eyes were wonderful eyes. "Did you think I was digging for fossils in a salt meadow?" queried the professor. "You can have read very little about the subject. I am digging for something quite different." I was silent. I knew that my face was flushed. I longed to say, "Well, what the devil are you digging for?" but I only stared into the hole as though hypnotized. "Captain McPeak and Frisbee ought to be here," he said, looking first at Daisy and then across the meadows. I ached to ask him why he had subpoenaed Captain McPeak and Frisbee. "They are coming," said Daisy, shading her eyes. "Do you see the speck on the meadows?" "It may be a mud hen," said the professor. "Miss Holroyd is right," I said. "A wagon and team and 2 men are coming from the north. There's a dog beside the wagon. It's that miserable yellow dog of Frisbee's." "Good gracious!" cried the professor. "You don't mean to tell me that you can see all that at such a distance?" "Why not?" I said. "I see nothing," he insisted. "You will see that I am right presently," I laughed. The professor removed his blue goggles and rubbed them, glancing obliquely at me. "Haven't you heard what extraordinary eyesight duck shooters have?" said his daughter, looking back at her father. "Jack says that he can tell exactly what kind of a duck is flying before most people could see anything at all in the sky." "It's true," I said. "It comes to anybody, I fancy, who has had practice." The professor regarded me with a new interest. There was inspiration in his eyes. He turned towards the ocean. For a long time he stared at the tossing waves on the beach, and then he looked far out to where the horizon met the sea. "Are there any ducks out there?" he asked at last. "Yes," said I, scanning the sea, "there are." He produced a pair of binoculars from his coat-tail pocket, adjusted them, and raised them to his eyes. What sorts of ducks?" I looked more carefully, holding both hands over my forehead. "Surf ducks and widgeon. There is one bufflehead among them. No, two. The rest are coots," I replied. "This," cried the professor, "is most astonishing. I have good eyes, but I can't see a blessed thing without these binoculars." "It's not extraordinary," said I. "The surf ducks and coots any novice might recognize. The widgeon and buffleheads I should not have been able to name unless they had risen from the water. It is easy to tell any duck when it is flying, even though it looks no bigger than a black pinpoint." But the professor insisted that it was marvelous, and he said that I might render him invaluable service if I would consent to come and camp at Pine Inlet for a few weeks. I looked at his daughter, but she turned her back. Her back was beautifully molded. Her gown fitted also. "Camp out here?" I repeated, pretending to be unpleasantly surprised. "I do not think you would care to," said Miss Holroyd, without turning. I had not expected that. "Above all things," said I, in a clear, pleasant voice, "I like to camp out." She said nothing. "It is not exactly camping," said the professor. "Come, you shall see our conservatory. Daisy, dear, you must put on a heavier frock. It is getting towards sundown." At that moment, over a near dune, 2 horses' heads appeared, followed by 2 human heads, then a wagon, then a yellow dog. I turned triumphantly to the professor. "You are the very man I want," he muttered. "The very man. The very man." I looked at Daisy Holroyd. She returned my glance with a defiant little smile. "Wall," said Captain McPeak, driving up, "here we be. Get out, Frisbee." Frisbee, fat, nervous, and sentimental, hopped out of the cart. "Come," said the professor, impatiently moving across the dunes. I walked with Daisy Holroyd. McPeak and Frisbee followed. The yellow dog walked by himself.